Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a day that most history books pretend didn't exist. A day that was both the most sacred and the most contradictory 24 hours in post-Civil War plantation life. We're talking about Sundays. Specifically, what Sundays actually looked like for black folks living and working on plantations after the war was supposed to have set them free. Now, you've probably got some vague image in your head already. Maybe church, maybe singing, maybe a quiet afternoon under a shade tree. And sure, some of that is in the picture. But the full picture is so much stranger, so much more layered, and so much more revealing than any single postcard memory could capture. Because Sundays on post-Civil War plantations weren't just a day off. They were a battlefield, a negotiation, a performance of freedom inside the bones of a system that was doing everything in its power to pretend the war hadn't changed a thing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. I'd also love to know, did your family have a Sunday ritual? Something that was non-negotiable, rain or shine? Maybe it was church. Maybe it was a particular meal. Maybe it was your grandmother side-eyeing anyone who dared to do yard work before noon, because the Lord was still watching. Drop it in the comments. I want to hear it. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Settle in. Maybe pull the covers up just a little higher, because tonight's story has warmth in it. Real warmth, the kind that comes from people carving out joy in a world that was actively trying to deny them any. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what Sunday actually meant for people who'd spent 6 days a week doing back-breaking labor on land they didn't own, for wages that barely qualified as money? What did it feel like to put on your best clothes when your best clothes were still patched and mended 3 times over? What happened inside those little wooden churches that sprang up across the South like wildflowers after the surrender? Did people actually rest? Or was Sunday just a different kind of work? What did the food taste like when you'd been eating somebody else's rations all week and finally got to cook what you wanted? What did freedom sound like on a Sunday morning in 1868, when freedom itself was still more of an idea than a guarantee? And what happens when the one day you're supposed to have to yourself becomes the day that everybody, planters, politicians, preachers, and the federal government, wants to control? Congratulations. You've just woken up on a Sunday morning somewhere in the rural South in the year 1868. You're on what used to be a plantation. Technically, it still is a plantation. Same land, same big house up the hill, same cotton fields stretching out in every direction like a quilt somebody forgot to finish. But the war ended 3 years ago, and everything is supposed to be different now. The 13th Amendment says you're free. The Freedmen's Bureau says you have rights. The planter up in that big house says you owe him half your crop, and you better not forget it. The first thing you notice is the silence. Not total silence. There's a rooster somewhere being unnecessarily dramatic about the sunrise, and you can hear the faint rustle of wind moving through the trees outside the cabin. But the silence that matters is the absence of the bell, or the horn, or whatever infernal instrument the overseer used to drag you out of sleep before dawn. That sound shaped your life for years, decades, maybe your entire existence up until 1865. And now it's gone. At least on Sundays it's gone. You lie there for a moment, and that moment is the whole point. Because during slavery, you didn't get moments. Every minute of every day belonged to somebody else. Even your sleep wasn't really yours. You slept because they needed you functional, not because they cared whether you were rested. But this morning, on this Sunday, you get to lie still. You get to feel the thin mattress beneath you. It's stuffed with corn husks or maybe moss, and it rustles every time you shift. And you get to decide on your own terms when to sit up. That decision, small as it sounds, would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. The cabin around you is modest in ways that the word modest was invented to politely describe. One room, maybe two if you're fortunate. The walls are rough-hewn logs or old planks, and the gaps between them have been stuffed with mud and cloth, and whatever else could keep the wind from slicing through at night. The floor is packed dirt in most cases, though some families have managed to lay down rough boards. There's a fireplace at one end, and the remnants of last night's fire are still glowing faintly, throwing just enough warmth to take the edge off the morning chill. The smell is wood smoke and earth and something faintly sweet. Maybe the molasses from last night's supper. Maybe the lye soap drying on a board near the door. You share this cabin with your family. Maybe it's a spouse and children. Maybe it's an extended arrangement. A mother, a sister, nieces and nephews. Someone who isn't blood, but became family through shared survival. The sleeping arrangements are close. Privacy is a concept that exists mainly in theory. But there's something about the closeness that feels less like a burden and more like proof. Proof that you're still here. Proof that the family they tried to sell apart, tried to scatter across state lines and auction blocks, has found its way back together. Not every family managed that. You know, people who are still looking, still sending word through churches and newspapers, and anyone heading in the right direction, trying to find children or parents or spouses who were sold away years ago. Some of those searches will go on for the rest of their lives. But your people are here, in this cabin, breathing in the same wood smoke. And that is no small thing. Here's the thing about Sundays in this period that most people don't fully grasp. The day off wasn't new. Even during slavery, most enslaved people got Sundays off from field labor. It was one of the few near-universal customs across the plantation South, rooted partly in Christian tradition, partly in the practical recognition that even the most brutal slaveholder understood that human bodies need rest to remain productive. But the nature of what Sunday meant had changed completely. Under slavery, your Sunday was a concession. It was time given to you by someone who owned you, and it could be taken away at any moment. The planter could decide that the cotton needed picking on a Sunday, and your day of rest would evaporate like dew on a July morning. After emancipation, Sunday was supposed to be yours by right. Not a gift, not a concession, a right. And the difference between those two things, a gift and a right, is the difference between everything and nothing. You sit up, swing your legs over the side of the bed, and your feet meet the cool floor. The children are still asleep, or at least pretending to be, which is a form of cooperation you appreciate. Your spouse is already stirring, moving quietly toward the fireplace to coax the embers back to life. There's water to fetch, and on any other day, you'd already be behind schedule. But today is Sunday. Today, the water can wait an extra 10 minutes while you sit and listen to the quiet. The morning routine on a Sunday is slower, more deliberate, almost ceremonial, because today you're going to church, and church is not a casual affair. Church in the post-Civil War Black South is possibly the single most important institution in your entire world. It's not just where you go to pray, though you absolutely go to pray. It's where you get your news. It's where you find out who's sick and who needs help and who just had a baby and who's thinking about leaving for Kansas or maybe Memphis. It's where marriages are formalized, where disputes are mediated, where community decisions get hashed out in the fellowship hour that somehow always stretches to 3. It's where children learn to read, because the church doubled as a school during the week. It's where you find out about labor contracts and whether the Freedmen's Bureau agent is going to visit this month. It's where your political organizing happens, because in 1868, black men can vote, and the church is where candidates come to make their case and where strategies get whispered between hymns. But before any of that happens, you have to get ready. And getting ready for Sunday church is a production. Let's talk about what you're putting on, because clothing in this period tells a story that words sometimes can't. During the week, you wear what you work in, rough, durable, practical. The fabric is usually Osnaburg, a coarse cotton weave that feels approximately like wearing a burlap sack that's learned the bare minimum about being clothing. It's cheap, it's what the planter provides, or what you can afford, and by Wednesday it's already stiff with sweat and soil. But Sunday clothes are different. Sunday clothes are the clothes you chose. Maybe you bought them with the tiny amount of cash you've managed to earn from your own garden plot. Maybe they were given to you by the Freedmen's Bureau or a Northern Missionary Society. Maybe you sewed them yourself or had them sewn by someone in the quarters who has a talent with a needle and thread and charges a fair price. The point is, whatever you're wearing on Sunday, it's yours in a way that your work clothes aren't. A clean white shirt, a dress with actual colour in it, not the drab tones of labour, but something that says you exist as a person with preferences and dignity. Maybe a hat. Hats are important. During slavery, elaborate dress among enslaved people was sometimes restricted or punished. Some slaveholders had explicit rules about what enslaved people could wear, viewing any display of personal style as a form of uppityness that needed to be stamped out. So wearing a good hat to church on a Sunday in 1868 is not just fashion, it's a declaration. It says, "I dress how I please now." That's not a small statement. That's everything. The children get cleaned up too. And if you've ever tried to get multiple children presentable for church on a Sunday morning with one basin of water, a sliver of lye soap, and a comb that has seen better decades, you understand that this is its own form of labour. Hair gets braided and oiled. Faces get scrubbed. Someone's shoe has a hole, and the solution is a piece of cardboard cut to size and slipped inside. A fix so universal across time and poverty that it probably has its own cultural heritage designation somewhere. The littlest one can't find their other sock, and the search becomes a whole community event because in a one-room cabin, there are only so many places a sock can hide, and yet somehow that sock has achieved a level of concealment that military intelligence would envy. You step outside, and the morning greets you with a particular kind of beauty that the rural South does better than almost anywhere on earth. The light is soft and golden, not yet hardened by the midday heat. The air smells like pine and turned earth, and maybe, if the wind is right, wood smoke from the other cabins where families are going through the same Sunday morning rituals you just completed. The quarters, that's still what people call this cluster of cabins, even though the word carries the ghost of its old meaning, are coming alive around you. Doors opening, children spilling out, women adjusting bonnets, men settling hats on their heads with the careful precision of people who understand that how you present yourself to the world is not vanity, but survival. There's a brief window of time before the walk to church that belongs to the small, essential rituals of Sunday morning preparation. Breakfast is simpler than the meal that's coming later. Maybe some leftover cornbread from yesterday. Maybe a bit of fatback or a boiled egg if the hens have been cooperative. Coffee, if you have it, is a luxury that most families can't afford on a regular basis, though some manage to stretch a small supply by mixing the grounds with chicory root or roasted corn, creating a brew that approximates coffee in the same way that a mule approximates a horse. It gets the job done, but nobody's fooled. You drink it because something warm in the morning feels like a small kindness, and small kindnesses are the currency of daily life. The yard around the cabin gets a quick tidying, not because anyone outside the community will see it, but because standards exist and they matter. A swept yard, and yes, people sweep dirt yards, using brooms made from bundled twigs or broom straw, creating patterns in the packed earth that serve both practical and aesthetic purposes, is a sign that this household takes pride in itself. The practice of yard sweeping has roots in West African traditions, where the swept compound was a communal living space kept meticulously clean. In the American South, it became a marker of domestic care that communicated something to neighbors and visitors. We may not have much, but what we have, we maintain. A messy yard on a Sunday morning would be noted, discussed, and gently judged by the community with the precision of people who have very few outlets for aesthetic expression and take the ones they have seriously. There might be flowers. This surprises some people. But flower gardens, small, determined patches of color planted near cabin doors and along fence lines, are common in post-Civil War black communities. Seeds traded between neighbors, cuttings shared after church, bulbs dug up and divided each fall, zinnias, marigolds, roses, when they can be coaxed into cooperation. These gardens serve no practical nutritional purpose, and that's precisely the point. Growing something purely because it's beautiful, in a life where almost everything else is dictated by necessity and survival, is an act of defiant luxury. It says that the human need for beauty doesn't disappear just because the human is poor. It says that aesthetics aren't a privilege reserved for people with leisure time and expendable income. It says quietly but unmistakably that you are a person who appreciates loveliness, who cultivates it, who refuses to live in a world entirely defined by labor and obligation. The zinnia blooming by your cabin door is a small revolution in petals. The walk to church might be short, or it might be miles, depending on where the nearest black church is. And this is worth pausing on, because the explosion of independent black churches after the Civil War is one of the most remarkable stories in American history, and it happened almost overnight. During slavery, worship was controlled. Many enslaved people were required to attend their slaveholders' church, sitting in segregated balconies or back sections, listening to white preachers deliver sermons that were specifically designed to reinforce obedience. The favorite text was Ephesians 6:5. Servants, be obedient to your masters. And if you think enslaved people didn't see through that theological manipulation, you haven't given them nearly enough credit. Alongside the official planter-sanctioned worship, there was always the invisible church, the hush harbors, secret gatherings in the woods, in cabins, in any space that could be shielded from the overseer's eyes and ears. This is where the real preaching happened. This is where spirituals were sung in full voice, where the Bible was interpreted through the lens of liberation rather than submission, where Moses leading his people out of Egypt wasn't just a story, but a prophecy and a promise. The risk was enormous. Getting caught at a secret prayer meeting could mean a whipping, or worse. But people went anyway, because the need for spiritual autonomy was that powerful. The need to worship God on your own terms, to hear your own preachers, to sing your own songs. That need ran deeper than fear. After emancipation, that invisible church walked out of the woods and into the light. Within months of the war's end, black congregations across the South were organizing, building, and establishing churches with a speed and determination that was nothing short of extraordinary. Some started in brush arbors, open-air structures made of poles and branches, barely more than a frame with a leafy roof. Some met in abandoned buildings. Some managed to put up simple wooden structures almost immediately, built by the same hands that had built the planter's house and the planter's barn and the planter's everything else. By 1868, there are thousands of independent black churches across the South. Thousands. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Zion Church, and various Baptist associations saw their membership explode. These weren't just places of worship. They were the institutional backbone of black life in the South. And Sunday was their busiest day. You're walking now, probably with your family and your neighbors, and the walk itself is a social event. Folks fall into step with each other. Conversations pick up where they left off last Sunday. There's an older gentleman everyone calls Deacon, who has opinions about everything and shares them with the confidence of someone who has survived enough to earn the right. He walks with a stick he carved himself, its handle worn smooth by years of grip, and he sets a pace that the rest of the group unconsciously follows. There's a young woman carrying a basket that smells suspiciously good, because after service there's going to be a meal and nobody shows up empty-handed if they can help it. The basket is covered with a cloth, but the aroma of whatever's underneath, maybe a peach cobbler, maybe biscuits still warm from the morning's baking, drifts through the morning air and makes small children walk a little closer to her than strictly necessary. There's a cluster of teenagers who are technically walking to church, but are primarily walking near each other in ways that their parents are choosing to not quite notice, because Sunday courtship operates on an elaborate system of plausible deniability that would put any diplomatic corps to shame. The road itself tells a story. It's a dirt path, packed hard by years of feet and hooves and wagon wheels, lined with wildflowers in the spring and dust in the summer and mud in the winter that can swallow a shoe whole if you're not careful where you step. You pass the fields that define your weekday existence, the cotton rows stretching toward the horizon, the tobacco patches, the plots of corn standing in their orderly ranks. On any other morning, the sight of those fields would carry the weight of obligation. But on Sunday morning, you walk past them like a free person walking past someone else's problem. The fields will still be there tomorrow. Today, they can wait. The church itself comes into view. And here's where I need you to adjust whatever image your mind has conjured. This isn't the stately brick church with stained glass windows. Not yet. Those are coming. And when they come, they'll be magnificent. The product of congregations pooling pennies and dimes over years to build something beautiful. But in 1868, the typical rural black church in the Plantations South is modest. It's a wooden structure, maybe whitewashed, maybe not. There's a door. There are windows, though glass is a luxury, and many have simple shutters or nothing at all. There's a rough wooden floor or just packed earth. There are benches. Actual pews are an upgrade that many congregations haven't reached yet. There's a pulpit, which might be an actual piece of furniture, or might be a plank laid across two barrels. And there's a stove, or there will be by the time winter rolls around, because a congregation that can survive a Mississippi January without heat is a congregation that fears God more than pneumonia. But here's the thing about this humble building that the physical description doesn't capture. When you walk through that door on a Sunday morning, you are walking into the only space in the entire post-Civil War South that is fully, completely unambiguously yours. Everything else in your life operates on a spectrum of white control. The land you work belongs to the planter. The store where you buy supplies is owned by someone who marks up prices because they can. The courts, the law, the roads, the schools that barely exist, all of it is under the authority of people who, 3 years ago, considered you property. But this church belongs to your community. The preacher is one of you. The deacons are your neighbors. The choir is your family. The rules that govern this space are rules that your community agreed upon together. In a world where genuine autonomy is still a daily fight, Sunday church is the one place where you can breathe all the way in. The service begins, and it begins with singing. Let's be clear about what singing means in a black church in 1868, because it's not background music, it's not a warm-up act. The music is the spiritual core of the entire experience, and it carries a history that stretches back across the Atlantic to West African traditions of communal song, call and response, and the belief that music isn't just something you listen to. It's something you participate in, something that connects you to the divine, to your community, and to every person who ever sang the same song before you. The hymns are a mix. Some are the old spirituals, the songs that were born in slavery and carry the weight of that origin in every note. Swing low, sweet chariot. Go down, Moses. Wade in the water. These songs functioned as multiple things simultaneously during slavery. They were worship. They were emotional survival. They were coded communication. They were declarations of hope in conditions designed to destroy hope. Singing them now in freedom, the songs take on new dimensions. They're no longer just about the hope of deliverance. They're also about remembrance. They're sung by people who can now look back at what they survived and honor the journey they've taken from that place to this one. Alongside the spirituals, there are newer hymns filtering in from the north, brought by missionaries and educators. There are songs being composed in real time by local musicians, because the creative energy in black communities after emancipation is staggering. People who had been denied the right to read, the right to assemble, the right to express themselves freely, are now pouring that pent-up creative force into music, into preaching, into poetry, into every available channel. The music in that little wooden church on a Sunday morning is not just beautiful. It's the sound of a culture reassembling itself, finding its voice, and singing at full volume for the first time. The congregation doesn't sit quietly and listen. That's not how this works. If you're picturing a stiff, silent audience politely absorbing a performance, clear that image out immediately. Black worship in this period is participatory, dynamic, and physical. People clap, people sway, people call out affirmations. The line between the choir and the congregation is blurry at best. When the Spirit moves someone, and on any given Sunday the Spirit is going to move someone, the response can be vocal, physical, emotional, and completely unrestrained. Shouting, as it's called, is a recognized and respected part of the worship experience. Someone might stand, raise their hands, cry out. Others might join them. The energy in the room builds and builds, and if you've never been in a space where collective emotion reaches that kind of intensity, it's hard to describe. It feels like the walls are vibrating. It feels like every joy and every sorrow that everyone in that room has ever carried is being lifted up and held by the group together. This would have been unthinkable in the slaveholders' church. This kind of worship, loud, physical, ecstatic, free, was exactly what the planter-sanctioned religious experience was designed to suppress. Sit still. Be quiet. Listen to the white preacher tell you that God wants you obedient. But now the doors of the hush harbor have been thrown wide open, and the worship that was once hidden is out in the sunlight, in a building with walls and a roof and a name painted over the door, and nobody can tell you to be quiet. The preacher steps to the pulpit, and this is the moment the whole morning has been building toward, because the black preacher in the post-Civil War South is not just a religious figure. He's the most important person in the community, and that's not an exaggeration. In a world where black people are systematically excluded from political office, though in 1868 that's starting to change, where access to lawyers and doctors and educators is sparse at best, the preacher fills every gap. He's counselor, advocate, negotiator, teacher, political organizer, and moral authority, all wrapped into one person, who probably also farms during the week, because the congregation can't yet afford to pay a full-time salary. Some of these preachers are extraordinary orators, self-taught, many of them, because formal education was a crime for enslaved people in most southern states. They learned to read in secret, by candlelight, using stolen moments and borrowed books, and a determination that defied every law designed to keep them ignorant. Others never learned to read at all and preach entirely from memory, from oral tradition, from a deep well of scriptural knowledge passed down through generations of worship in the invisible church. And here's what's remarkable. The ones who can't read are often just as powerful, sometimes more powerful, than the ones who can. Because the black preaching tradition doesn't depend on literacy. It depends on rhythm, on call and response, on the ability to take a biblical text and make it breathe, make it walk, make it sit down in the pew next to you and whisper your name. The sermon this morning might be about Moses. It's often about Moses. The Exodus story has been the central narrative of black Christianity since enslaved people first encountered the Bible and saw their own story reflected in Israel's bondage and liberation. But in 1868, the Exodus takes on a complicated new resonance. Because the Red Sea has parted, the chains have fallen, you're out of Egypt, but you're not in the promised land yet. You're in the wilderness. And the wilderness, as anyone who's read the book of Numbers can tell you, is no picnic. The wilderness is where the freed people wander, unsure of the path, harassed by enemies on every side, tempted to go back to the certainty of bondage, because at least in bondage you knew where your next meal was coming from. The preacher draws the parallel without being heavy-handed about it, because everyone in the room is living the parallel. They know what the wilderness feels like. They're standing in it. Or maybe the sermon is about Nehemiah rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. That's another favorite, because black communities in the post-Civil War South are quite literally building churches, building schools, building families that slavery tore apart, building an entire infrastructure of free life from almost nothing. Nehemiah built with a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other, ready to work and ready to defend. And that's not a bad description of what daily life feels like for black folks in the South in 1868. The preacher's voice rises and falls, and the congregation responds in real time. Amen. Preach. Say it. Well, that's right. This isn't interruption. This is the engine that drives the sermon forward. The preacher feeds off the congregation's energy, and the congregation feeds off the preacher's words, and the whole thing builds in a spiral of increasing intensity until the sermon reaches its peak, what the tradition calls the climax or the shout. And the emotional release in the room is something you can physically feel. People weep, people shout, people embrace each other. The grief and the joy and the exhaustion and the hope all come rushing out at once. And for a few minutes, the little wooden church, with its rough benches and its packed dirt floor, becomes the most powerful place on earth. But here's the thing about the sermon that the stories don't emphasize enough. It's not just spiritual, it's political. In 1868, with the 14th Amendment being ratified and the 15th on the horizon, with black men voting for the first time in Southern elections, with Reconstruction governments being formed that include black legislators and officials, the Sunday sermon is where political education happens. The preacher might not stand up and say, "Vote Republican on Tuesday." Actually, he might. Many do, and why wouldn't they? The Republican Party is the party of Lincoln, the party that freed the slaves, the party that's pushing for black citizenship and voting rights. The Democrats in the South are the party of the old planter class, the party actively working to restore as much of the old order as they can manage. This isn't a subtle distinction. This is existential. So the sermon weaves together the spiritual and the political in ways that would make a modern congregation uncomfortable, but that feel perfectly natural in 1868. The preacher talks about the vote as a sacred responsibility. He talks about citizenship as a covenant. He talks about the ballot box in the same breath as the communion table, because in this moment, for this community, spiritual liberation and political liberation are the same thing. They can't be separated. To worship freely and to vote freely are both expressions of the same fundamental right. The right to be fully human, fully present, fully counted. There are also practical announcements woven into the service, because the church is the community bulletin board, the help desk, and the mutual aid society all at once. Someone's roof needs fixing, and a work crew is being organized for next Saturday. A family just arrived from 2 counties over, displaced by a planter who decided he didn't want to honor their labor contract, and they need a place to stay. The Freedmen's Bureau is sending an agent next month, and anyone with a contract dispute should bring their papers. A school is opening in the church on weekday, evenings, and a teacher from the north, probably a young white woman from New England, possibly idealistic to the point of naivete, definitely braver than she knows, is going to be leading classes. Anyone who wants to learn to read, come Tuesday at sundown. Bring a candle if you have one. That last announcement lands differently than you might expect. Learning to read. 3 words that sound so simple and carry such extraordinary weight. Under slavery, literacy was forbidden. In many southern states, teaching an enslaved person to read was a criminal offense, and the punishment for the enslaved person caught learning could be savage. The reasoning was transparent and brutal. Literate enslaved people could read abolitionist literature, could forge passes, could communicate across plantations, could organize. Literacy was power, and the entire system of slavery depended on keeping that power out of black hands. So when the preacher announces that reading classes are starting, the ripple that goes through the congregation isn't casual interest. It's hunger. People who've spent their entire lives navigating a world of written documents they couldn't decipher, contracts, laws, newspapers, the Bible itself, are being offered the key to a locked room they've been staring at through a window for decades. Elderly men and women who never imagined they'd read a word will show up on Tuesday night alongside children, and nobody will feel embarrassed, because everyone in that room understands what it costs to be kept illiterate, and everyone understands what it means to finally have the chance. The service winds on. There are prayers, long, deeply felt prayers, that name specific people and specific needs. There's someone sick, and the congregation prays for them by name. there's someone who's gone north looking for work, and the congregation prays for their safe journey. There's a general prayer for the community, for protection against the violence that everyone knows is real and present, because 1868 is not a safe time to be black in the South. The Ku Klux Klan is already active. Night riders are already terrorizing black families. The threat hangs over everything like weather. You can't always see it, but you can always feel it. And Sunday prayers acknowledge that reality without dwelling in it, because dwelling in fear is a luxury this community cannot afford. Then comes the collection. And this might surprise you, because these are people living at the bare edge of economic survival. Sharecropping contracts are designed to keep black laborers in perpetual debt. Wages, when they're paid at all, are a fraction of what white workers earn. Many families are growing most of their own food just to get by. And yet, when the collection plate comes around, people give. Pennies mostly, sometimes a nickel. Occasionally, someone drops in a coin that represents a genuine sacrifice. Money that could have gone toward shoes or salt or fabric. They give because the church is theirs, and keeping it running is an act of collective self-determination. They give because generosity in the face of poverty is a form of resistance. They give because the preacher has to eat too, and the roof needs patching, and those Tuesday night reading classes need candles and chalk. The economics of a post-Civil War black church are a marvel of communal resourcefulness. An entire institution funded by people who have almost nothing, sustained by the shared conviction that some things matter more than personal comfort. And the giving doesn't stop at coins. People give what they have. A farmer brings a portion of his garden harvest, a sack of sweet potatoes, a bundle of collard greens, a few ears of corn, and leaves it near the pulpit for the preacher's family. A woman who keeps chickens brings eggs. Someone who's handy with wood offers to build new benches or repair the church steps. The economy of the black church in this period operates on a system that combines monetary contributions with labor, goods, and skills, creating a functional mutual support network that would impress any modern economist if they bothered to study it. The church doesn't just receive, it redistributes. Families in crisis receive food from the church pantry, such as it is. Widows and orphans are looked after. The sick are visited and fed. The collection plate isn't just funding a building. It's funding a social safety net built entirely from the bottom up, by people who understood that if they didn't take care of each other, nobody else was going to do it for them. Every penny in that plate is an act of faith. Not just faith in God, but faith in the community's ability to sustain itself through collective effort and shared sacrifice. After the formal service, the church empties slowly, because nobody's in a rush to leave. This is the fellowship hour, though calling it an hour is generous in the wrong direction. It's more like a fellowship afternoon. People gather outside if the weather is good, under trees if the sun is too strong, back inside if it's raining. And this is where the real business of the community happens. The women cluster in groups that look casual, but function with the precision of a planning committee. Who needs food this week? Whose children need watching while she works? Who's pregnant and when is she due? And who's going to be there when the time comes? The mutual aid networks in post-Civil War black communities are sophisticated, highly organized, and absolutely essential to survival. There's no government safety net. There's no insurance. There's no savings account. What there is each other. And the women, in particular, build and maintain the invisible infrastructure that keeps families from falling through the cracks. They know who's struggling before anyone says a word, because they pay attention. Because paying attention to each other is what kept people alive during slavery, and it's what keeps people alive now. The men gather too, and their conversations lean toward labor and politics, which in 1868 are essentially the same subject. The sharecropping contracts that most black families work under are a new form of economic control that looks different from slavery, but feels, in many ways, like its direct descendant. Here's how it works. The planter owns the land. You work the land. At harvest, the crop is split, typically half and half, though the exact terms vary, and the variation almost always favors the planter. But here's the catch, and there's always a catch. You need seed to plant. You need tools to work. You need food to eat while the crop is growing. And where do you get all of that? From the planter, on credit, at prices he sets, recorded in books you can't read, with interest rates that would make a modern credit card company blush. By the time the harvest comes and the accounting is done, your half of the crop barely covers what you owe. Some years, it doesn't cover it at all, which means you start the next year already in debt, which means you can't leave, which means you're bound to the land by economics instead of chains. Different mechanism, similar result. So when the men are talking after church on a Sunday, they're talking about contracts. They're talking about whether Brother Johnson got a fair deal, or whether his planter is cheating him on the weights. They're talking about that family over in the next county who just packed up and left in the middle of the night because the planter was threatening them. They're talking about the Freedmen's Bureau. Is it helping? Sometimes. Are the agents fair? Some of them. Can you trust the system? That question gets a lot of different answers, and none of them are entirely comfortable. They're also talking about voting. This is crucial. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 enfranchised black men across the South, and in 1868, elections are happening that will shape the future of every person standing in that churchyard. The conversations are urgent, sometimes heated. Who should we support? Can we trust this white Republican candidate? Or is he just using our votes to get into office and then forgetting we exist? Should Brother Williams run for the state legislature? He's smart enough, Lord knows, and he can speak. But what would it cost his family if he puts himself out there like that? The violence against black political figures is real and escalating. Every man who steps into a polling place is taking a risk, and every man who runs for office is taking a bigger one. These Sunday conversations aren't idle political chat. They're strategic planning sessions conducted in the churchyard because the churchyard is the safest space available. The children, meanwhile, have been released from the obligations of sitting still and being quiet, and they've scattered like seeds in a wind. The churchyard becomes a playground, running, chasing, climbing, doing all. The things that children do when they're finally free of adult expectations. Some of them are playing organized games. Others are making up games on the spot with the improvisational genius that only children possess. The older children are helping with the younger ones. Because in a community where every adult works 6 days a week, the older children carry real responsibility. A 12-year-old watching 3 younger siblings isn't babysitting for pocket money. She's a load-bearing pillar of the family structure, and she's been one since she was old enough to hold a baby on her hip. There's also, and this is important, pure unstructured joy. Children laughing, children being silly, children existing in a space where nobody is going to sell them away from their parents, where nobody is going to put them to work in a field before they're old enough to hold a hoe properly, where they are, for this one day at least, allowed to simply be children. The sound of black children playing in a post-Civil War churchyard is the sound of a future being imagined. It's the sound of possibility. Now, let's talk about the food, because the Sunday meal after church is an event of enormous cultural and emotional significance. And honestly, it's also just really good food, and I refuse to walk past that without giving it the attention it deserves. The Sunday meal in black communities on post-Civil War plantations draws from a culinary tradition that is itself a story of survival, ingenuity, and cultural preservation. During slavery, the food that enslaved people ate was largely determined by what was rationed to them, typically cornmeal, salt pork, or fatback, and maybe some molasses. It was monotonous, insufficient, and deliberately cheap. But enslaved people supplemented those rations in every way they could. Small garden plots, when allowed, produced vegetables, collard greens, sweet potatoes, black-eyed peas, okra. Foraging added wild greens, berries, nuts. Fishing and trapping, when time and opportunity permitted, added protein. And the cooking itself drew heavily on West African culinary traditions that had survived the Middle Passage. Techniques for seasoning, for slow cooking, for transforming the cheapest ingredients into something that nourished not just the body, but the spirit. After emancipation, these food traditions didn't just survive, they flourished, because now you had somewhat more control over what you grew, what you cooked, and how you ate. The garden plot that was once a grudging concession from the slaveholder was now your garden, on your terms. And Sunday was when the cooking went from sustenance to celebration. The centerpiece of a Sunday meal might be chicken. Not always. Chicken was a relative luxury, and whether you had one depended on whether you kept your own flock. If you did, a Sunday chicken was raised, killed, plucked, and fried or stewed by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Fried chicken in the black culinary tradition isn't just food. It's a whole philosophy rendered in hot oil and seasoned flour. The technique, seasoning the bird, dredging it in flour, frying it in cast iron until the crust is golden and the meat is falling off the bone tender, was perfected by black cooks over generations, many of them cooking in plantation kitchens, where they fed the slaveholder's family food that the slaveholder's family could never have produced on their own. The irony is thick enough to fry in. The same hands that were considered unfit to hold a ballot were considered indispensable in the kitchen, and the culinary expertise that white Southerners would later claim as their own regional heritage was, in large part, black expertise, black creativity, black tradition. Alongside the chicken, there are greens, collard greens, mustard greens, turnip greens, slow cooked with a piece of smoked meat until they're silky and rich and flavored with pot liquor that people literally drink, because wasting it would be a culinary sin. There are sweet potatoes, maybe roasted in the coals, maybe mashed with a little butter if butter is available. There's cornbread, made from the same cornmeal that sustained people through slavery, but prepared now with care and pride. Maybe with a little egg beaten in, maybe cooked in a cast iron skillet so the edges get crispy and the center stays soft. There are black-eyed peas. There's okra, possibly fried, possibly stewed, its presence on the plate a direct line back to West Africa, where the plant originated and where it was cultivated for centuries before it crossed the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships, alongside the people who knew how to grow it and cook it. The meal is communal. Families eat together, obviously, but the boundaries between families are porous on a Sunday afternoon. Food is shared. A woman who made more cornbread than her family needs sends the extra to the widow down the row. Someone brings a pie, sweet, potato naturally, and it gets divided among more people than the pie was strictly designed to serve. But nobody complains because sharing is the whole point. The meal isn't just about nutrition. It's about communion in the most literal sense of the word. It's people gathered around food they grew, cooked, and chose to share, in a community they're building from scratch, on a day that belongs to them. The eating happens on porches, under trees, in cabins with doors flung open to the afternoon air. People sit on whatever's available, chairs, benches, overturned buckets, the ground itself. The conversation flows with the ease of people who've known each other through the worst of times and are now, cautiously, hopefully, navigating something that might be better. There's laughter, there's gossip, because gossip is the original social network and it runs on zero electricity. There's storytelling. Older folks holding court with tales that entertain and instruct in equal measure, because in a culture with deep oral traditions, the Sunday afternoon storyteller is a keeper of history, and the stories they tell carry lessons that no textbook could convey. Let's linger on the storytelling for a moment, because it matters more than it might seem. In a community where many adults are still illiterate, not by choice, but by the deliberate design of a system that made their education a criminal act, oral tradition isn't a quaint cultural artifact. It's the primary technology for preserving and transmitting knowledge. The stories told on Sunday afternoons include everything from family histories to practical survival advice to trickster tales rooted in West African traditions. Brer Rabbit, the small, clever figure who outwits larger, more powerful animals through ingenuity and cunning, is not just a children's story. He's a survival manual encoded as entertainment. Every story about the small outsmarting the strong is a lesson about navigating a world where you are never the one with structural power, and yet you find ways to win anyway. These stories were told during slavery, and they're still being told now, because the need for that kind of wisdom hasn't disappeared just because the legal framework of bondage has. There are also the ghost stories and the haunt tales, because Sunday afternoon storytelling isn't exclusively wholesome. As the daylight shifts and the shadows get longer, the stories get darker. Tales of haunted crossroads, spirits that walk at midnight, things seen in the woods that don't have good explanations. These stories draw from a blend of African spiritual traditions, Christian cosmology, and the specific horrors of the southern landscape. A place where enslaved people were buried in unmarked graves generates ghost stories that aren't just entertainment. They're a way of acknowledging the dead, of insisting that the people who were erased from official records are still present, still remembered, still part of the community's story. When someone tells a tale about a spirit walking the old path behind the cotton press, they're keeping that person's memory alive in the only way available. The afternoon stretches on, and the pace of life on a Sunday is so different from the other 6 days that it almost feels like a different world. During the week, time is the planter's. You work from sunup to sundown, and the rhythm of your day is dictated by the crop, the weather, and the overseer. Or, in the post-war version, the landowner, who's found subtler ways to exert the same control. But on Sunday, time loosens. You can sit without guilt. You can walk without purpose. You can do nothing at all. And doing nothing, after a week of relentless physical labor, is itself a form of restoration that goes beyond physical rest. Some people use the afternoon for personal projects. Remember, even though you're sharecropping on the planter's land, you likely have a small plot of your own. A garden, maybe a fraction of an acre, where you grow food for your family, or small cash crops that you can sell independently. Sunday afternoon might be when you tend that garden, and nobody bats an eye at the apparent contradiction of working on the day of rest. Because this work is different. This work is yours. The distinction between labor you perform for someone else's profit and labor you perform for your own sustenance is the distinction that separates bondage from freedom, and everybody understands that instinctively. Others spend the afternoon visiting. The geography of post-Civil War plantation life is scattered. Families live in clusters on different plantations, sometimes miles apart, connected by dirt roads and footpaths that wind through fields and woods. Sunday is the day you walk to the next plantation to see your sister who married a man from that community. Sunday is the day your cousin comes by from wherever he's been working this season. Sunday is the day the social fabric of black life in the rural South gets rewoven, thread by thread, visit by visit, conversation by conversation. These visits matter enormously because one of the most devastating legacies of slavery is the deliberate destruction of family ties. People were sold away from their spouses, their children, their parents. Families were scattered across plantations, across counties, across state lines. After emancipation, the effort to reconstitute these families is one of the great untold stories of American history. People walked hundreds of miles. People placed advertisements in newspapers, heartbreaking, hopeful little notices saying, "Information wanted of my mother Sarah, who was sold from the Johnson plantation in 1855. Any information about her whereabouts would be gratefully received." These searches went on for years, sometimes decades, and Sunday visits, in their quiet way, are part of this ongoing effort to rebuild what was torn apart. Every visit reinforces the bonds that slavery tried to sever. Every Sunday afternoon spent on someone's porch, sharing food and stories, and just being together, is a small act of defiance against a system that said black families didn't matter, didn't exist, weren't real. Now, I need to talk about something that complicates this picture, because if I only told you the warm parts, I wouldn't be telling you the truth. The planter is still there. The big house is still up on the hill. And the planter's relationship to your Sunday is more complicated than simple indifference. Some planters, particularly in the first years after the war, genuinely did not care what their black laborers did on Sundays, as long as they showed up for work on Monday. The war had broken something in these men. Not their racism, Lord knows that was fully intact, but their ability to micromanage every aspect of black life. They were exhausted. Many of them were financially ruined, and policing Sunday behavior was a luxury they couldn't afford when they were trying to figure out how to run a plantation without free labor. But other planters viewed Black Sundays with deep suspicion and active hostility. The independent black church, in particular, made white Southerners profoundly nervous. A space where black people gathered in large numbers, spoke freely, discussed politics, and organized collectively. That sounded to many white Southerners like the ingredients for insurrection. And the memory of Nat Turner, whose 1831 rebellion was partly organized through religious gatherings, was still fresh enough to give that fear a historical foundation. White newspapers ran editorials warning about the dangers of black religious independence. White political leaders argued that black churches needed white oversight. Some planters actively tried to prevent their laborers from attending church services, or demanded that a white observer be present, or pressured black congregations to accept a white-approved preacher. These efforts mostly failed, which is itself remarkable. Black communities in the post-Civil War South fought for their Sundays with a tenacity that reflected just how much the day meant to them. The right to worship independently, to gather freely, to control their own time. These weren't abstract principles. These were the tangible markers of freedom, and surrendering them was unthinkable. When a planter tried to restrict church attendance, workers pushed back through their labor contracts, through appeals to the Freedmen's Bureau, through the simple, powerful act of going to church anyway and daring the planter to do something about it. The Freedmen's Bureau, for all its limitations and inconsistencies, generally supported black workers' right to Sundays off, and having that federal authority behind them, however unevenly enforced, gave black communities a lever they hadn't had before. But the tension never fully resolved. It simmered, it flared, and it was part of the larger struggle over what freedom actually meant in practice. A struggle that defined the entire Reconstruction era and whose echoes are still audible today. Let's shift to the afternoon now, to the hours between the big meal and sundown, because this stretch of time has its own particular character, and it's one of the most human parts of the whole Sunday story. The heat, if it's summer, is at its peak. The deep south in July and August is not a climate. It's a punishment. The air is thick, wet, heavy. It sits on you like a blanket you didn't ask for and can't remove. Even the insects seem sluggish, though their sluggishness doesn't prevent them from biting. In this heat, the afternoon takes on a drowsy, slow quality that's perfectly suited to a day of rest. People seek shade under the big oak tree that every southern community seems to have, under the porch overhang, inside cabins where the open windows create just enough cross-ventilation to make the heat bearable, if not comfortable. This is nap time, and I don't mean that casually. The Sunday afternoon nap in the post-Civil War Black South is an institution. After a week of labor that has pushed your body to its limits, after a morning of church that has pushed your spirit to its heights, after a meal that has filled you in ways that go beyond your stomach, sleep comes for you with a gentleness that the Monday morning bell will never match. People nap on pallets, on porches, on patches of grass in the shade. Children fall asleep in tangled heaps, limbs overlapping, breathing in sync. The old folks doze in chairs with their hats tipped over their faces. And for a little while, the world goes quiet. There's something profound about voluntary rest. During slavery, even sleep was a form of enforced compliance. You slept because the system needed you rested for tomorrow's labor. Your body's need for rest and the slaveholder's need for your productivity happened to align, and so you were allowed to sleep. But Sunday, afternoon napping isn't about tomorrow's productivity. It's rest for its own sake. It's rest because you're tired, and rest feels good, and nobody has the right to tell you otherwise. That distinction matters. It's the difference between a caged animal sleeping and a free one choosing to lie in the sun. But not everyone naps. Some folks use this quiet afternoon stretch for something equally restorative, but far more practical: washing. And I don't mean the quick splash from a basin that got you through the morning. I mean the real washing, the Sunday wash. If there's a creek or a river within walking distance, and in the rural South there almost always is, Sunday afternoon is when people go to it. The creek serves a dozen purposes throughout the week. It's where you draw water, where you fish when you can, where clothes get scrubbed against rocks when there's time. But on Sunday afternoon, the creek becomes something closer to a sanctuary. Women take children to bathe, scrubbing away the accumulated grime of a week's living in close quarters with limited water. The water is cool, sometimes shockingly so, and the sensation of it on skin that's been baked by 6 days of southern sun is a pleasure so simple and so complete that it feels almost spiritual. The children treat it as a swimming hole naturally, because a child's ability to transform any body of water into a recreational facility is one of the universal constants of human existence. They splash, they shriek, they dunk each other. They do things that their mothers have explicitly told them not to do, and their mothers pretend not to see because even mothers need a break. And the sound of children playing in water is one of the more peaceful sounds on earth. The creek also serves as a gathering place for women in ways that the churchyard doesn't. There's something about the privacy of the creek bank, the distance from the cabins and the men, and the formal structures of community life that loosens tongues. This is where women talk about things they don't talk about in the churchyard, about difficult pregnancies, about husbands who drink too much of whatever corn liquor is circulating through the quarters, about the particular fears that come with raising black children in a world that is actively hostile to their existence. These conversations are quiet, practical, and fiercely intimate. They happen while wringing out clothes and braiding wet hair and keeping one eye on the children in the water. And they are the invisible emotional labor that holds families together when everything else is trying to pull them apart. For the men, the Sunday afternoon might involve a different kind of maintenance, mending tools, patching a roof, doing the small repairs that keep a cabin livable. A hinge that's been squeaking all week finally gets attention. A fence post that's leaning gets straightened. These aren't the planter's tasks. These are your tasks for your home, such as it is, and the distinction matters. There's a particular satisfaction in fixing something that belongs to you, even if belongs to you is a generous description of a cabin that sits on land you're renting with labor you can barely afford to give. The cabin is still yours in the ways that count. It's where your family sleeps, where your children were born, where you come home to at the end of every day. And keeping it standing is an act of domestic sovereignty that nobody can take from you. There's also the matter of healing and medicine, and Sunday is when a lot of that happens too. The nearest doctor, if there even is one willing to treat black patients, might be miles away, and his fees are almost certainly beyond what you can pay. So the community has its own healers, root workers, herb women, people who carry medical knowledge passed down through generations, much of it originating in West African healing traditions that survived the Middle Passage alongside the people who practice them. The herb woman, and it usually is a woman, though not always, knows which plants cure a fever, which bark makes a tea that settles a stomach, which poultice draws infection from a wound. She knows that sassafras root brewed into tea purifies the blood, or at least that's what the tradition says, and the tradition has kept people alive long enough to be taken seriously. She knows that a mustard plaster on the chest helps with congestion, that willow bark eases pain, that certain roots and leaves have properties that Western medicine won't formally acknowledge for another 100 years. Her knowledge is empirical, accumulated through centuries of observation and practice, and it's indispensable in a community where professional medical care is essentially non-existent. On a Sunday afternoon, she might check on someone who's been sick. She might prepare remedies for the week ahead, drying herbs, mixing tinctures, bundling leaves. People come to her not just for physical ailments, but for spiritual ones too. Because in the healing traditions of the Black South, the body and the spirit aren't separate categories. They're interconnected, and treating one without the other is like trying to fix a roof while ignoring the foundation. A woman who can't sleep might need chamomile tea, or she might need a prayer, or she might need both, and the herb woman is equipped to provide all of it. Some of these healing practices make the preacher uncomfortable, just as the secular music does. There's an ongoing negotiation in post-Civil War black communities between Christian orthodoxy and the older spiritual traditions that predate the community's encounter with Christianity. Root work, conjure, the use of charms and protective objects. These practices exist alongside church-going in ways that aren't contradictory to the people who practice them, even if the preacher insists otherwise. A woman can pray to Jesus on Sunday morning and consult a root worker on Sunday afternoon without seeing any conflict, because her understanding of the spiritual world is larger and more complex than any single tradition can contain. She's drawing from everything she has: Christian faith, African-descended spiritual practice, practical folk medicine, and the hard-won wisdom of personal experience. And she's using all of it to keep herself and her family alive. If the preacher has a problem with that, well, the preacher is welcome to come treat her child's fever himself. Let's go back to the children for a moment, because the games they play on a Sunday afternoon deserve more than a passing mention. These aren't random acts of play. They're a sophisticated system of physical education, social learning, and cultural transmission disguised as fun. Ring games are everywhere. Children form circles and sing songs while acting out movements, clapping patterns, partner exchanges, chase sequences. These games have names that vary by region and by community, and they've been passed down through generations with the adaptability that characterizes all living traditions. New verses get added, old ones get modified. The essential structure remains: a circle, a song, a pattern of movement that teaches coordination, cooperation, and the rhythms of communal life. Then there's the rougher play: wrestling, racing, climbing trees, with a competitive intensity that turns every oak into an athletic event. The boys, in particular, engage in physical contests that serve a practical purpose beyond entertainment. In a world where physical labor will define your adult life, childhood play is training. Strength, speed, endurance, balance, all of it is being developed in the churchyard and the field behind the cabins. And nobody calls it exercise, because exercise is a concept that belongs to people who don't work with their bodies every day. For these children, physical capability isn't a hobby. It's a survival skill. The girls play too, with an energy that matches the boys even if the specific games sometimes differ. They jump rope using vines or twisted cloth, chanting rhymes that carry encoded social information. Who likes whom? What the rules of proper behavior are? What happens to children who don't mind their manners? They play house, which is simultaneously the most adorable and the most revealing form of childhood play, because the houses they're playing are the houses they actually live in, and the scenarios they act out: cooking, cleaning, caring for babies, managing a household on almost nothing, are the scenarios they'll be living for real in a few short years. Their play isn't escapist, it's rehearsal. And then there are the quiet games: string figures, cat's cradle, and its infinite variations, practiced with whatever string is available. Guessing games, counting games, games that require nothing more than two people, a patch of dirt, and imagination. These games are particularly important because they're what happen when the running and the shouting wind down, when the energy shifts from explosive to contemplative, when the afternoon begins its slow slide toward evening. The child who was racing around the churchyard an hour ago is now sitting cross-legged in the dirt, intensely focused on a game of jacks played with small stones. And the transition between those two modes of being is itself a skill that Sunday teaches. How to move between activity and rest, between community and solitude, between the public self and the private one. Now, while all of this is happening in the quarters, it's worth asking what Sunday looks like up at the big house, because the planter's Sunday is happening simultaneously, and the contrast is instructive in ways that go beyond simple inequality. The planter and his family attend their own church, the white church in town, probably a sturdier, more established structure than the black church, with actual pews, actual glass windows, and a minister who went to seminary and has opinions about Greek conjugations. The sermon is unlikely to mention Exodus in any way that might make the congregation uncomfortable. The collection plate is heavier. The fellowship hour features lemonade instead of creek water. The children are better dressed, better fed, and blissfully unaware that their comfort is built on a system that is morally bankrupt. But here's the thing that complicates even this picture. The planter's Sunday in 1868 is not the planter's Sunday of 1858. The war took something from these families that no amount of sharecropping contracts can fully replace. The wealth is diminished. The labor force, while still functionally captive through economic mechanisms, is no longer literally owned. The social order that made the planter a king on his own land has been challenged, if not overthrown. And on Sundays, this loss is felt most acutely, because Sunday used to be the day when the planter's authority was most visible. Home, when his enslaved people worshipped in his church, under his eye, at his discretion. Now they have their own church, their own preacher, their own God, who apparently doesn't endorse servitude, and there's nothing the planter can do about it that doesn't risk intervention from the Freedmen's Bureau, or worse, draw the attention of the federal troops still stationed across the South. So the planter sits on his porch on a Sunday afternoon, looking out over land that's still his, but that feels somehow less his than it did before the war, and he nurses a whiskey and a grievance. He can hear, faintly, the singing from the black church down the road. He can see the smoke from the cooking fires in the quarters. He knows that his workers are gathering, talking, organizing, building something that doesn't include him and doesn't need his permission. And this bothers him in ways he may not fully articulate, but that run deep. Because the planter's power was never just about economics. It was about control, total control. Control over labor, over movement, over worship, over family, over time itself. And Sundays, those autonomous, joyful, self-directed Sundays, are proof that the control is slipping, one day at a time. Some planters respond to this loss of control with resignation. Others respond with resentment that curdles into action, supporting the clan, manipulating contracts, using every legal and extra-legal tool available to claw back authority. The Sunday that feels like freedom to you feels like threat to them. The church that feels like sanctuary to you feels like sedition to them. The music that sounds like joy to you sounds like defiance to them. And in a way, they're right. It is defiance. Every Black Sunday in the post-Civil War South is an act of defiance against a social order that insists black people don't deserve autonomy, don't deserve community, don't deserve joy. The fact that it's also worship and fellowship and family and rest, that's what makes it so powerful. It's defiance dressed in Sunday clothes, carrying a hymnal, smelling like fried chicken and cornbread, and there is nothing the planter can do to stop it. When the afternoon shadows start to lengthen and the worst of the heat begins to loosen its grip, the community stirs back to life with a different energy than the morning carried. The morning was purposeful. Church clothes, church manners, church business. The afternoon was rest. But the early evening belongs to something else entirely. This is the social hour, the real one. The one where the formality drops away and people are just people. Being together because they want to be, not because the schedule demands it. Young people, in particular, come alive in the Sunday evening hours, and this is where courtship happens, with an elaborate, unspoken choreography that deserves its own chapter in the history of human romance. During the week, there's no time. You're working from dawn to dark, and whatever energy remains at the end of the day goes toward basic survival, cooking, mending, tending the garden, collapsing into sleep. But Sunday evening opens a window, and young men and women step through it with a careful mix of eagerness and restraint that would be comical if it weren't so deeply human. A young man doesn't just walk up to a young woman and declare his interest. That's not how this works. He finds reasons to be in her vicinity. He offers to carry something. He laughs a little too loud at something his friend says, making sure she notices. He might, if he's bold, ask to walk her home from church, a request loaded with so much implication that it might as well be a marriage proposal in miniature. And the young woman, for her part, is conducting her own campaign with equal subtlety. She knows exactly who's watching. She's positioned herself near enough to be approachable, but far enough to maintain the dignified distance that her mother has absolutely coached her on. Her friends are nearby, serving as both audience and advisory committee. And later tonight, every glance, every word, every moment of that interaction will be analyzed with a thoroughness that would put a congressional hearing to shame. The older folks watch all of this with a mix of amusement and genuine investment, because in a community where family is everything, where family was the thing that slavery tried hardest to destroy and freedom is trying hardest to rebuild, courtship isn't just personal, it's communal. A new couple means a new household, a new family, new children, new strength for the community. And the elders who've survived slavery, who've watched families torn apart at the auction block, who've spent years searching for lost spouses and children, they watch young love with an intensity that has nothing to do with nostalgia and everything to do with hope. Every new beginning is proof that the system didn't win. Every couple holding hands in the Sunday evening light is a rebuttal to every bill of sale that ever separated a husband from a wife. Marriage itself, in this period, is undergoing a revolution that doesn't get nearly enough attention. During slavery, marriages between enslaved people had no legal standing. None. You could stand before your community and pledge yourself to another person, and many people did, in ceremonies that were deeply meaningful to those involved. But the law didn't recognize it. Your slaveholder could sell your spouse away tomorrow, and there was no legal recourse, no appeal, no authority you could turn to. The phrase, "till death do us part," had a cruel additional clause that nobody spoke aloud, or until master decides otherwise. After emancipation, one of the first things black couples did was formalize their marriages legally. The Freedmen's Bureau recorded thousands upon thousands of marriages in the years immediately following the war. Couples who'd been together for decades, who'd raised children together, who'd survived together, who'd built a life together under conditions that made building a life nearly impossible, lined up to get a piece of paper that said what they'd always known. This is real. This counts. This is recognized. And on Sundays, the church was often where new marriages were celebrated, where anniversaries were acknowledged, where the institution of black marriage reasserted itself as something permanent, something legal, something that nobody could dissolve with a bill of sale. Let's move to another part of the Sunday evening that matters more than it might appear at first glance. Music. Not the hymns from this morning's service, though those are still humming in people's heads. This is different music. This is the secular music, the social music, the music that lives alongside the sacred tradition, and sometimes makes the church folks a little uncomfortable. Someone has a fiddle. Someone always has a fiddle, because the fiddle is one of the central instruments in Black Southern musical culture and has been since the 18th century. Black fiddlers were famous. During slavery, an enslaved man who could play the fiddle was in demand for dances and social events on plantations across the region. Some slaveholders hired out their enslaved fiddlers to other plantations for entertainment, pocketing the earnings themselves naturally. The skill and artistry of these musicians was widely acknowledged even by people who refused to acknowledge their humanity in any other context, which tells you everything you need to know about the selective blindness of American racism. After emancipation, the fiddle remains, but it belongs to the player now. And on a Sunday evening, when the church obligations are fulfilled and the preacher has gone home and the evening air carries that particular quality of softness that the South does so well, someone pulls out a fiddle, and the music that emerges is something the hymn books don't contain. It's dance music, reels, jigs, breakdowns, music rooted in a fusion of African rhythmic traditions, European folk melodies picked up from generations of proximity, and the uniquely American innovation that happens when cultures collide and create something new. There's also the banjo, and here's a piece of history that surprises people who haven't encountered it before. The banjo is an African instrument. Its ancestors, gourd-bodied, string-necked instruments, were played across West Africa for centuries before the transatlantic slave trade brought both the instruments and the people who played them to the Americas. The banjo was a black instrument long before it became associated with Appalachian folk, music, and bluegrass. In the post-Civil War South, black banjo players are keeping alive a musical tradition that stretches back across the ocean, and on a Sunday evening, the sound of a banjo plucked on a cabin porch is a direct line to a heritage that the Middle Passage couldn't drown. Not everyone approves of the Sunday evening music, and this tension is worth exploring because it reveals something important about the complexity of black community life in this period. The church, which is the moral center of the community, generally takes a dim view of secular music and dancing. The preacher who delivered that powerful sermon this morning might well view Sunday evening dances as a backsliding into worldly behavior that undermines the spiritual progress of the community. Some churches have explicit prohibitions against dancing. Some deacons consider the fiddle an instrument of the devil, which is a theological position that the fiddle player finds both amusing and irrelevant. This tension between the sacred and the secular isn't a flaw in the community. It's a sign of its richness. These are people who are, for the first time, building a culture entirely on their own terms. During slavery, every aspect of cultural expression was filtered through the reality of bondage, what was permitted, what was hidden, what was punished. Now, in freedom, the community is negotiating its own values, its own boundaries, its own sense of what matters. And that negotiation isn't always smooth. The church mother who purses her lips at the sound of the fiddle, and the young woman who can't keep her feet still when the music starts are both expressing legitimate impulses, and the community holds both of them without breaking. That's what healthy communities do. They contain contradictions, they argue, they keep going. But whether the elders approve or not, the music happens, and where there's music, there's dancing. And the dancing in post-Civil War black communities is a tradition that would eventually reshape American culture in ways that nobody standing in that Sunday evening gathering could possibly imagine. The ring shout, a shuffling, rhythmic, circular movement accompanied by clapping and singing. has roots in West African spiritual practices and has been part of black worship and celebration since the earliest days of slavery in the Americas. The Juba dance, involving complex rhythms beaten out on the body, chest, thighs, knees, because drums were banned on most plantations as a precaution against communication and uprising. Flat-footing, buck dancing, what would later evolve into tap. All of it is here, in embryonic or fully developed form, on a Sunday evening in the rural South, performed by people who are dancing because they can, because their bodies are their own now, because movement is joy, and joy is resistance, and resistance is survival. The children watch the dancing and try to imitate it, and this is how cultural transmission works, not through textbooks or formal instruction, but through a 5-year-old watching a teenager do something incredible with their feet and thinking, I want to do that. The older dancers encourage the younger ones, teaching steps and rhythms with the patient repetition of people who understand that they're passing something down, something that matters, something that connects the child standing here in 1868 to ancestors who danced on the other side of an ocean. And the music doesn't stay in one place. It travels. As the evening deepens, the sound of the fiddle carries across the quarters, through the trees, out over the fields. Someone on the next plantation over can hear it, faintly, and maybe they start their own music in response. And for a little while, the whole landscape hums with sound that nobody sanctioned, nobody approved, and nobody can silence. During slavery, this kind of spontaneous, uncontrolled music making was viewed with suspicion by slaveholders. Sound travels, music organizes, rhythm communicates. The slaveholders were right to be nervous, in their own twisted way, because music did all of those things and more. It kept people sane. It kept traditions alive. It created community across distances that the plantation system was designed to enforce. And now, in freedom, the music does all of that openly, without apology, filling the evening air with evidence that this community is not just surviving, but creating, not just enduring, but celebrating. There are songs being made up on the spot too. Improvisation is central to black musical tradition, and on a Sunday evening, with the pressures of the week temporarily lifted and the fellowship of the day still warm in everyone's chest, someone is always inventing something new. A fiddler tries a melody he's been hearing in his head all week. A singer adds verses to an old song, making it about something that happened yesterday or last month or this morning at church. The music is alive in the most literal sense. It grows, it changes, it responds to the moment, it refuses to be fixed or finished. Every Sunday evening performance is unique, unrepeatable, a one-time collaboration between musicians and audience and moment that will never happen exactly this way again. Nobody records it. Nobody writes it down. It exists for the length of a song and then lives on only in the memories of the people who heard it, who will carry fragments of it into next week's music, and the week after that, in an endless chain of creative reinvention that will eventually produce the blues and jazz and gospel and rock and roll and every form of popular music that the 20th century will claim as its own, without always acknowledging where it started. Right here, on Sunday evenings, on the porches, and in the yards of people who had almost nothing except the irrepressible human need to make something beautiful out of sound. As the evening deepens and the light fades from gold to amber to the soft blue of dusk, the energy of the community shifts again. The dancing slows. The conversations grow quieter. The children, who've been running on some inexhaustible fuel source all day, finally begin to flag. You can see it in their movements. The running becomes walking. The shouting becomes murmuring. And eventually, even the most determined holdout succumbed to the gravitational pull of a parent's lap or a blanket spread on the ground. This is the hour when the older folks take over. The grandparents, the great aunts, the elders who've seen more of the world than anyone should have to see and survive to tell about it. As the light fades, the stories come out. Not the playful stories of the afternoon, but the deeper ones. The ones that carry weight. The ones that begin with "when I was young" and open into whole worlds that the younger generation has only heard about secondhand. An old woman might tell the story of how she was separated from her mother at age 7, sold to a planter 300 miles away, and didn't see her mother again for 30 years. She tells it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, because self-pity is a luxury she's never had and doesn't want. But the facts themselves carry all the emotional weight the story needs. Separated at 7, 300 miles, 30 years. The children listening don't fully understand the scale of that loss. Not yet. But the story plants itself in them, and it will grow as they grow. And one day they'll tell it to their own children, and the chain of memory will hold. An old man might tell about the night the freedom came, how the Union soldiers appeared on the road, how the slaveholder gathered everyone in the yard, how the words were spoken, "You're free," and how nobody quite knew what to do with those words at first. He might describe the silence that followed, a silence so complete and so strange that it felt like the whole world had paused to take a breath, and then the sound that broke the silence. Maybe a shout, maybe a prayer, maybe just a long exhale, the kind of breath you let out when you've been holding it for 250 years. These stories aren't nostalgia, they're infrastructure. In a community where written records are scarce, where official history either ignores you or lies about you, where the institutions of memory, archives, libraries, museums, are controlled by people who have a vested interest in telling a different version of events, oral tradition is how truth survives. Every story told on a Sunday evening is an act of preservation. Every elder who shares their experience is doing the work that historians and archivists do, but without the funding, the recognition, or the institutional support. They're doing it because somebody has to, and because the alternative, letting the truth die with the people who lived it, is unacceptable. The children who listen to these stories don't always understand what they're receiving. A 7-year-old sitting in the dirt, half asleep, ears still tuned to an elder's voice describing the day freedom came. That child doesn't know yet that she's being given something priceless. She doesn't know that 50 years from now, she'll be the elder telling the same story to her own grandchildren, adding her own chapters, her own details, her own layers of meaning to a narrative that stretches back further than any single life can contain. The oral tradition works precisely because it doesn't announce itself as something monumental. It embeds itself in the ordinary rhythms of community life. Sunday evenings, front porches, the space between supper and sleep. And it passes from generation to generation with the ease of something natural, something inevitable, like water finding its way downhill. Some of the stories carry humor alongside their weight, because the Black storytelling tradition has never believed that gravity and laughter are mutually exclusive. An old man telling about the day his former slaveholder tried to convince him to stay on and work just like before, except now we'll call it something different, delivers the punchline with a timing that has the whole porch laughing. The laughter isn't dismissive. It's the laughter of people who've learned that sometimes the only sane response to absurdity is to laugh at it, to name it, to refuse to let it have the last word. Humor in these stories functions the same way it functions throughout Black cultural tradition. as a weapon, a shield, and a form of grace all at once. There are also the stories about the living, updates from the wider world, carried by people who've traveled or received letters from those who have. A cousin in Memphis says there's work in the factories. A brother in Kansas says the land is flat and wide, and you can own it outright if you're willing to work it. Someone heard that black men are serving in the state legislature in South Carolina, actually sitting in the seats of power, actually making laws. These pieces of news circulate through Sunday evening conversations like oxygen, feeding the sense that the world is larger than this plantation, larger than this county, larger than this state, and that somewhere out there, the future is being built by people who look like you. Let's talk about what happens as full darkness settles in, because the nighttime hours of a Sunday carry their own particular weight in this time and place. The darkness in the rural post-Civil War South is total in a way that modern people rarely experience. There are no streetlights. There are no porch lights. There are no headlights on distant highways. When the sun goes down and the moon hasn't risen or is hidden behind clouds, the darkness is absolute, and it presses in against the walls of the cabin with a physical presence. During slavery, nighttime was both dangerous and liberating. It was dangerous because the patrol, bands of white men authorized to police enslaved people's movement after dark, rode at night, and being caught outside your cabin without a pass could mean a beating or worse. But nighttime was also when the invisible world of enslaved resistance operated. Night was when people slipped away to the hush, harbors to worship. Night was when runaways made their breaks for freedom, navigating by starlight and the North Star. Night was when information passed between plantations through networks that the slaveholders never fully understood or controlled. After the war, nighttime takes on new dangers. The Ku Klux Klan, which forms in 1866, operates primarily at night. Night riders, sometimes Klan, sometimes loosely organized groups of white men with similar intentions, terrorize black communities under cover of darkness. They target black political leaders, black landowners, black families who are perceived as too successful or too independent. They burn churches, the very churches where this morning's worship happened. They show up at cabins in the dead of night, masked and armed, delivering threats or worse. The violence is systematic, strategic, and designed to achieve through terror what the Confederacy failed to achieve through war: the subjugation of black people and the restoration of white supremacy. So when darkness falls on a Sunday night, the warmth of the day's fellowship exists, alongside an awareness of danger that never fully goes away. Doors are secured. Conversations drop to lower volumes. Someone, probably one of the men, positions himself where he can see the road, not because he expects trouble tonight specifically, but because trouble doesn't send advance notice, and vigilance is the price of survival in a world where the law is either unwilling or unable to protect you. This is the reality that complicates any romantic telling of the post-Civil War Sunday. Yes, it was a day of community and worship and food and music and joy. All of that is true and important and should be told, but it existed within a larger context of ongoing threat, economic exploitation, and a political struggle whose outcome was far from certain. The people who built those Sundays, who organized those churches, cooked those meals, sang those songs, told those stories, danced those dances, did so knowing that the freedom they were exercising was contested, fragile, and actively under attack, and they did it anyway. That's the part that should take your breath away. Not just that they suffered, which they did, but that they refused to let suffering define the entirety of their experience. They insisted on joy. They insisted on community. They insisted on Sundays. Inside the cabin, the Sunday night routine begins. The good clothes get carefully removed, folded, and stored away for next week. You don't toss your Sunday best over a chair. These clothes represent an investment of money you can barely spare, and dignity you can always afford, and they're treated accordingly. The everyday clothes come back out, the work shirt, the heavy skirt, the boots that are cracked and resoled and will need to last another season. Tomorrow is Monday, and Monday means the field, and the field doesn't care what you sang in church this morning. The children are put to bed, and the bedtime ritual in a post-Civil War black family cabin carries its own tenderness. A mother braiding her daughter's hair for the night, fingers moving with the automatic precision of a gesture repeated 1,000 times, each twist and tuck a wordless conversation between generations. A father sitting on the edge of a pallet, telling a quiet story to a child who is fighting sleep with the desperate determination that only small children can muster. Eyes snapping open every time they start to drift, as if staying awake were a moral obligation and surrender were out of the question. A grandmother humming something low and slow, maybe a spiritual, maybe a lullaby, maybe something so old that its origins have been lost even to the singer's memory. A melody carried across an ocean and through centuries of bondage, and somehow still intact, still warm, still doing exactly what it was always meant to do. The sound fills the small cabin like water filling a cup, warm and complete. The littlest children go down first, of course. They've burned through whatever mysterious energy source powers childhood and have nothing left. One by one, they surrender to sleep with the sudden totality that only children can manage. Awake one moment, unconscious the next, as if someone flipped a switch. The older children take longer. They lie in the dark listening to the adults murmur, catching fragments of conversation they're not supposed to hear, and filing them away for later consideration. A 10-year-old in 1868 carries more awareness of the world's dangers than any child should have to carry. And the quiet of bedtime is when that awareness surfaces. Questions about the night riders, about the planter, about what will happen if the crops fail, about whether the family will still be together next year. These worries don't always get spoken aloud. Sometimes they just exist in the dark, heavy and formless, and the only antidote is the sound of a parent's breathing nearby, steady and sure. A rhythm that says, "We're here, we're together. We're going to be all right." There might be a final prayer, not the structured communal prayers of the morning service, but something smaller and more personal. A whispered conversation with God, conducted in the near darkness of a cabin, lit only by the glow of the fireplace coals. Thank you for this day. Keep us safe through the night. Give us strength for the morning. Watch over the ones who aren't here, the ones who were sold away, the ones who went north, the ones who didn't survive to see freedom. These prayers are intimate in a way that public worship can never be. They're the private negotiations between individual souls and whatever power they believe is listening, and they carry the accumulated weight of every hope and every fear that the day's fellowship kept at bay. You lie down, and the corn husk mattress rustles beneath you in that familiar way that has become the sound of home. The cabin is quiet now, or as quiet as a one-room structure full of sleeping people ever gets. Someone breathes heavily. Someone shifts. A child murmurs something unintelligible and burrows deeper into the blanket. Outside, the sounds of the southern night assert themselves. Insects, frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl, the wind moving through the trees with a sound like slow breathing. And here, in this moment between waking and sleep, is where the full weight of the Sunday settles over you. You went to church, you sang, you prayed, you listened to a sermon that made you feel for an hour like Moses himself was speaking directly to your situation. You ate food that you grew and cooked and shared. You sat with people who know your name, your story, your family. You watched your children play in the open air without fear, or at least without the specific, daily, grinding fear that they would be taken from you and sold. You heard music, you told stories, you rested. And tomorrow, you'll wake before dawn and walk to the field and spend the day bent over cotton plants in heat that makes your vision blur, working land that someone else owns, under a contract that someone else wrote, in a system that someone else designed to keep you perpetually in debt and permanently dependent. Tomorrow, the planter's world reasserts itself, and your labor will make someone else wealthy while you scrape by on what's left. But that's tomorrow. Tonight, you had a Sunday, and the Sunday was yours. Here's the thing about post-Civil War Sundays that historians sometimes miss when they're busy cataloguing the political and economic structures of Reconstruction. The Sunday wasn't just a break from labor. It was the weekly practice of freedom. It was the day when black communities rehearsed what a fully free life might look like, and then carried that rehearsal back into the struggle of the other 6 days. Every church service was a practice run for democratic participation. Every shared meal was a practice run for economic cooperation. Every story told was a practice run for cultural preservation. Every song sung was a practice run for artistic expression. The Sunday was the seed. Everything that grew from it, the institutions, the movements, the culture, started here, in these humble gatherings, in these rough-built churches, in these small cabins on land that wasn't yours yet. The Freedmen's Bureau agent who visited your area last month wrote in his report that the black population showed remarkable industriousness and an eagerness for self-improvement that contradicts the assertions of their former masters. What a bloodless way to describe what you know from living it. Remarkable industriousness, as if building an entire civilization from nothing. Churches, schools, families, economies, political organizations, mutual aid networks, cultural institutions, while facing active, violent opposition from every direction, were merely industrious. As if the sheer audacity of insisting on your humanity in a world that spent 2.5 centuries denying it were just eagerness for self-improvement. But that's how it gets written down. That's how your story enters the official record, filtered through the language of people who can admire your resilience without ever fully understanding what it cost. You know what it cost. You carry the cost in your body, in the ache of your back, in the roughness of your hands, in the way your knees protest when you kneel to pray. You carry it in your mind, in the memories you can't shake, in the faces of people you'll never see again, in the knowledge of what was done to your family and your people, and the ongoing reality that the doing isn't fully over. And you carry it in your spirit, in the weariness that sometimes settles over you like a fog, the moments when you wonder whether this new freedom is real or just another version of the same old trick, dressed up in different clothes. But then you remember this Sunday. You remember the singing. You remember the sermon about Nehemiah building the walls. You remember your daughter's face when she ate the sweet potato pie. You remember the way the whole congregation stood together during the closing prayer. Hands clasped, voices joined. A room full of people who'd been through the fire and come out the other side still standing. And you think, maybe this time it's real. Maybe this time The freedom takes root and grows into something that even the night riders can't burn down. Maybe. That maybe is everything. That maybe is what gets you up on Monday morning. That maybe is what keeps you working, keeps you fighting, keeps you showing up at the polls despite the threats, keeps you sending your children to that Tuesday night reading class despite the risk, keeps you putting money in the collection plate despite having almost nothing to spare. That maybe is the most powerful force in the post-Civil War South, more powerful than the Klan's terrorism, more powerful than the Planters' ledger book, more powerful than every law designed to keep you down. Because the maybe isn't just hope, it's evidence. You've seen what your community can build in 3 short years of something approximating freedom. You've seen the churches go up, the schools open, the families come together. If this is what we can do in 3 years, you think, imagine what we can do in 30. Imagine what we can do in 100. Imagine what our grandchildren's grandchildren will build on the foundation we're laying right now, on Sundays, in little wooden churches, in cabins with dirt floors, with nothing but our hands and our faith and our refusal to be anything less than free. The fires burn down to a faint glow, barely enough to see by. The cabin is fully dark now, and the sounds of sleep surround you. The steady breathing, the small movements, the deep quiet of people at rest. Outside, the southern night is vast and dark and full of things that are both beautiful and dangerous, just like the freedom you're learning to navigate. Your eyes close. The last thing you feel is the warmth of the person sleeping beside you. A warmth that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with presence, with loyalty, with the stubborn insistence on love in a world that tried its hardest to make love impossible. You built a Sunday, you'll build another one next week, and the week after that, and the one after that, until the Sundays string together into a story that nobody can erase, a story about people who took the one day that was theirs and turned it into the foundation of everything that came after. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed, a bed with a mattress that doesn't rustle with corn husks, in a room with walls that don't have gaps, in a house with a door that locks and lights that switch on, and a world outside that, for all its problems, doesn't include anyone legally owning another human being. Whisper a quiet thank you to the people who built those Sundays. Thank the woman who got up before dawn to press the church clothes. Thank the preacher who taught himself to read by candlelight and then turned around and taught a whole congregation. Thank the men who stood in churchyards discussing politics in a world where that discussion could get them killed. Thank the grandmother who told stories after dark so that the truth would survive even if the official records tried to bury it. Thank the fiddler who played on a Sunday evening because music was a right, not a privilege, and silence was a form of surrender he refused to accept. They built Sundays so that one day their descendants could build whole weeks, whole lifetimes, whole worlds. They carved freedom out of a single day and then fought to expand it, inch by painful inch, generation by generation, into the rest of the week, the rest of the year, the rest of history. They didn't do it because they were certain it would work. They did it because the alternative, accepting that Sunday was all they'd ever have, was unacceptable. They did it because they believed, with a faith that defied every rational calculation of odds, that the Sunday was a beginning, not an ending. And they were right. History rarely gives proper credit to the people who build things quietly. The politicians get the chapters. The generals get the monuments. The industrialists get the buildings named after them and the portraits hung in boardrooms. But the people who showed up every Sunday to a small wooden church, who put pennies in the collection plate, who taught children to read by candlelight, who planted gardens and cooked meals and sang songs and told stories and held families together with nothing but will and love. Those people built the foundation that everything else stands on. They are the reason the story continues. They are the reason you're here. So close your eyes tonight and let yourself rest the way you deserve to rest. Rest the way they rested on Sunday afternoons. Not because someone allowed it, but because rest is your right, earned and inherited, and passed down through generations of people who knew that even the hardest fight requires a pause, a breath, a moment of stillness before the next dawn breaks. Sleep well. And if somewhere in the quiet of the night you hear something that sounds like singing, faint, distant, rising and falling like a river over stones, don't be alarmed. That's just memory doing what it does, carrying forward, holding on, refusing, after all these years and all these miles and all these Sundays, to let go. Good night.